Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. And I'm joined by Claire Anscombe, who is lecturer in fine art at De Montfort University in Leicester, England. Claire, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor.
Okay, cool. So we're talking about artificial intelligence and its role in the art making process. And so you have this really cool paper out called Creating Art with AI, which came out this year, 2022, in the journal Ardredec, which I probably just mispronounced, but whatever. And so I guess, thinking about AI, we've all seen, if we are on the internet, right, all of these artificial intelligent art making or image generating systems like Dolly or the most recently, I guess, is Lensa, however you pronounce it, right? And the first question I just want to start with is the most general and I think also the most basic is, are these images that these AI systems are generating art, right? Are they works of art or are they something else? How should we think about these things?
Well, I think that we can think of them as we might think of images more broadly. Not all images are art. And it largely depends on perhaps how they came into being, what sort of context they came into being in, and also perhaps how they're used more broadly as part of a specific kind of practice. So it may be the case that, some of these AI generated images are sort of just interesting images, but not necessarily being created, perhaps for artistic purposes, if you like, or to kind of be used as part of an artistic practice or context. So I think it really is very context dependent. I don't think anything sort of just comes out as art. There's always a specific history. And often, well, I think most definitions of art at least can agree that some form of intentionality is necessary. Which of course will bring us to the question of sort of what kinds of intentions need to be involved in art making, and are these the sorts of intentions that are present when these AI images are generated?
Awesome, cool. And so, I think one thing that you talk about in the article is there's this parallel between artificial intelligence systems and photographs, right? Or rather cameras, right? That they're producing images, and not all photographs are artworks, right? That there's, you know, photos you take on holiday, or there's a squirrel in the backyard and you want to, catch an image of it. And I guess there has to be parallels to dig into here. So just dig into for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the most interesting parallels perhaps is this argument, the kind of skeptical argument that was made about photography. Certainly when it was first invented and when photographs were kind of first being shown and exhibited, that they were made by a mechanical device. And if that's the case, then surely they can't be art. There's no human kind of hand and mind behind the creation of these objects. And so that sort of, at least according to the kind of skeptics' view, would rule them out as being artworks. Now, that view has been challenged from a number of different angles. Firstly, we might challenge whether photography is a purely mechanical process, as many skeptics like to see it. So there's been a lot of work around this, particularly recent developments actually in the philosophy of photography, debating the so-called kind of orthodox view, which very much sees the camera just as this mechanical device that, a photographer, they'll take a picture and what was before the lens pretty much just, is imprinted on the photosensitive material. We've got that view versus then the view of the so-called new theorists of photography, who argue, well, no, there's intentionality throughout this process. Certainly parts of it are automated, that reaction of light on a photosensitive surface, that's certainly something that does happen independently of the hand and mind of an agent. but that isn't true for every single kind of step that's required to make a photograph. And so with photography, we have this debate then, about whether, what kind of making this involves. Those who practice, those who are kind of working photographers, I think will find themselves aligning a bit more with the sort of new theory side of things, which has this sort of multi-stage account of making, which, at many different points offers the opportunity for human agents to intervene, to determine kind of how the features of the image will turn out, to determine kind of what actually gets registered on the photosensitive materials, how they then in turn get processed, either perhaps by digital means or analog means. And so, yeah, there's sort of room for intentionality throughout this process, right? So as I kind of highlighted earlier, kind of key to most accounts of art, what it means to make a work of art is some form of intentionality. And so we kind of lose that sort of bite from the skeptics argument if we sort of actually take a step back and take a moment to look at what the photographic process actually entails, which does indeed potentially allow a lot of room for intervention. This, of course, is not always how photography is used. Sometimes it very much is just used to sort of try and capture as best you can how something looks in front of you, and it might require very minimal intervention. But even that doesn't necessarily rule out that the end product is an art one. So one example might be someone like an artist like Vera Lutter, who creates these giant pinhole cameras, in like room-sized pinhole cameras. They're incredible. She creates these enormous photo-sensitized pieces of paper and just leaves the work, the photosensitive paper, to just register whatever light is hitting it for maybe like up to 4 days. And her aim to do this is, to like capture the dynamism of like a city or a scene in flux, or like one particularly memorable piece is a Zeppelin that was being worked on and tested. She hadn't anticipated that the Zeppelin would be actually out of the place where it was being, the hangar where it was being kept during that time. And so you get the semi-translucent Zeppelin in the end. These aren't actually features that she fully anticipated, but they sort of fall within the remit of this broader aim, what we might call the perhaps, an artistic aim, perhaps, to reflect through kind of aesthetic properties like the kind of dynamism that we might see that ends up on the surface of this print by allowing it to expose for so long. To see this kind of changing scene. So there are a number of ways that we can sort of challenge the skeptical arguments about kind of how photography is or isn't art. And the same is, perhaps equally true of AI. So just as those early kind of skeptics of photography would criticize, the ascription of kind of arthood to photographic works, on the basis that they were too mechanical, that no kind of human agent was kind of sufficiently involved in their making to count as art. We can also challenge this story, of course, for AI artworks. That the argument might be, well, they just do what they do without any human intervention, and so how can they possibly be artworks? Of course, we can challenge that in a similar way, actually, to photographic works. And there really is a tendency, particularly in popular media sometimes, to kind of overstate just how autonomous AI systems are. Society would probably look a lot different if they really were as autonomous as claims tend to be made that they are. Behind even the most advanced AI image generating systems are enormous amounts of time where humans have had to train these systems. And, if we go back to earlier models, that might be literally humans sitting at a computer for like an entire, days and days and days, weeks, months, years, maybe, just like identifying like a cat in a picture. In the earliest systems, it would be very, very kind of manual. And that's not so much the case now as these systems have moved on and they've become more advanced, but there's still enormous amounts of human labor that goes into creating these systems, and indeed that goes into curating their outputs. An AI image generator, as anyone who's tried, can spit out probably more work than, you know, some artists make in their entire lifetimes in sort of one sitting. And it's not the case that all of that ends up sort of being seen or shown or, you know, even kind of looked at. So there's also, you know, huge amounts of human intervention in these processes as well. And of course, if we think about kind of how these systems work, it might be the case that, you know, you're amassing a training set for your system. It might be that you're collecting a series of images. You want the system to have a particular output, right? So for instance, I did a project where I'm very interested in the use of beauty filters on social media platforms. So I collected a series of images that were made where participants filtered themselves using a particular filter. And I fed this into a very accessible, friendly image system. And yeah, you know, the output that I got, whilst it was unexpected, the features that I got at the end weren't, you know, very finely determined by me. The overall set was still within a certain parameter of kind of expectation. And, you know, that I think sums up quite nicely how often we do actually want to kind of interact with an AI. There's a lot of really interesting research about creating AI kind of partners, collaborators, to kind of help with creative endeavors. And a lot of this research seems to suggest that actually we don't like it when AI systems sort of start going too far away from what it is that we're interested in doing in our own sort of endeavor, or if an AI system, if it's the kind that is made to sort of make creative suggestions, for example, if it sort of starts to become a bit too demanding or overbearing, again, human participants were not so keen on that. But there's also perhaps this very fine balance of actually what do we want these systems to do ultimately, if they're sort of to serve our purposes. It's perhaps to kind of do something a bit new, a bit unexpected, but perhaps not so far outside of what we want, that it's sort of unrecognizable as being what we were interested in exploring in the first place. And, you know, the same is true of newer kind of text to image generators. Again, there's still heavy human input. If you think about some of the really creative prompts that people enter into these systems, actually that in itself can be like perhaps, you know, a very, very creative act trying to figure out what to actually enter as the text and what you'll sort of get out at the other end. I have a student who's working on text to image generators at the moment to produce images of biblically accurate angels, and has really been struggling to find the right prompts to get out the sort of output that would actually match the description of, you know, the hundreds of eyes and wings that we kind of find in the Bible. So yeah, there's just so much scope for human input and intervention that, you know, it would be foolish to think that AI systems are just generating this stuff entirely autonomously. Sorry,
Yeah,
that went
right.
really off piste.
Yeah, right. That, you know, it can very much be a multi-stage process in the way that photography can be, right? With photography, you have the intention of capturing a particular image, and then you can crop it and resize it and dodge and burn and manipulate the image in all sorts of ways until you get like the right contrast, et cetera, that, okay, this is the image that I want to produce,
Yeah.
right? And it's the same with artificial intelligence systems, right? That those tools that are available online for people to use, right? That you could type in a particular prompt and what it spits out is garbage, right? It's nothing like what you wanted. And so you alter the prompt, right? And then maybe one of the image it produces is sort of like you want. And so you keep messing around with it until you get roughly in the ballpark with respect to what you want. And so it is very much, you know, as you were describing, that when it's way too far off from our expectations, we generally are upset with it, right? And if we're going to post those images on social media, like, look at all the garbage that, you know, this system generated for me. And so as you're talking, right, there's a few questions here, right, that as the media talks about it, as you mentioned, sort of this very exaggerated, hyperbolic way of talking about it, right? That some people want to think of these artificial intelligence systems as the artists, right? That these are the things that are producing the art. Whereas as you're describing it, it's more like a tool, right? That we use in the way that the camera is similarly a tool that we use to produce image. These artificial systems are also a tool, although obviously there's the difference of the way in which they can generate things that we really don't like or expect. And in a way, we could think about them, and I think this is how you write about them in the article as well, is maybe we should think of them as collaborators to a certain extent. And so how should we think about these systems with respect to, are they artists? Are they merely tools? Are they collaborators? If so, in what sense are they active participants in the collaborative process, and so on? So how should we think of these systems?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and not an easy one to answer. I think that they seem to go a little bit beyond the status of just being a tool. Typically, we might think of a tool as being something that is passive, that is kind of used according to our will. It can't kind of have any input itself. It might do things that we don't expect, like sort of a paintbrush might kind of splay in a way that we didn't quite expect, and it might in that way sort of like generate some kind of properties in the kind of act of painting that we weren't expecting, but it's not in and of itself sort of doing that. That's just kind of physics maybe, or something that's kind of a very kind of causal relation. Whereas if we're looking at something like an AI system, well, this is something that has actually been designed to not be passive. A camera, certainly a kind of more optically based one, software-based cameras now sort of complicate this picture a little bit, but a kind of more traditional like DSLR or something, which is optical, where the hardware is really, again, it's very passive. It is the case that it will, depending upon how you kind of tweak the settings on the camera, it will sort of just capture ultimately the material that you've got there, right? That of course changes with an AI system. It is able to work without you really intervening at all. There are long periods of work where it can go away and it can generate properties and formal features that, you're very hands off. It does all of the work for you, right? And not only that, as we just highlighted, it can generate unexpected new features, things that you weren't quite expecting to come out the other end. Someone may not have a third ear in real life, but they might with this AI image. And it's done that autonomously in a sense, right? It has done that by itself. You didn't necessarily, you didn't do something that caused it kind of directly in the way that you might if you're kind of capturing something photographically, to make this third ear appear. And so in that sense, they seem to sort of transcend toolhood. They seem to go a little bit beyond just being these kind of passive, perhaps quite inert things that we just use. Instead, they seem to be things that we perhaps work with, in a sense. In a sense, what we end up doing can depend upon what they generate. Which in turn, as we've sort of highlighted, can create these really interesting feedback loops. So often when one is kind of using an AI system, you won't just kind of stop once you've kind of got your initial kind of output. You'll then kind of keep going back and tweaking maybe the prompt that you entered, or, you might go back and let the model kind of keep on training itself. It's like a kind of GAN-based model. So there is this sense then that sort of what you do affects the kind of outputs it produces, but then the outputs it produces also affect what you then in turn input back into the system. So we sort of get this really interesting kind of reciprocal feeling sort of arrangement. It does almost feel sometimes like you are working with I sort of don't want to say someone, but, you know, something that is able to actually kind of, you know, have some sort of say or kind of determine sort of what you're doing in a way that when you're using a kind of tool like a paintbrush or something, you sort of don't have that sense of kind of reciprocity. So yeah, it seems to kind of occupy this interesting new territory for something that is not a human agent, but something that we seem to work with that isn't a tool. Now, whether it's a collaborator is, of course, another question then, largely because what do we actually mean by a collaborator? Well, if we kind of think about the ways that collaboration may manifest itself in art practice, we have a couple of different options. So kind of, you know, looking at all the literature, there's been quite a bit now recently that's been written about collaboration in art, which is great. It's something that's often been ignored. But we can have co-authorship, for instance. We can have co-creators, as Katerina Banzanichi has recently argued. And we can also have perhaps collective kind of working setups where we have agents who we work with, but they themselves maybe don't determine very many of the properties of the work or kind of what kind of processes are going to be used to make it. So, you know, when we're looking at something like a co-author, we might be looking at agents who have perhaps kind of depending upon whose account you kind of turn to, it might be the case that they form these kind of meshing kind of subplans. If you kind of go, I think, with more sort of Paisley Livingston's account of this, it might be the case that if you go with Sandra Bacharach and Deborah Tollefson's account, it might be the case more that they kind of agree to take responsibility for the work as a whole. It might be that they don't always kind of perfectly synchronize their actions with each other, but they agree that as a whole, they're responsible for this, and there's a kind of intentionality there to create a thing. It might be more of a categorical kind of intention rather than specific kind of granular sort of intentions about what is created. But in either case, you know, sort of whichever way you sort of look at co-authorship, it does demand a certain kind of uncoerced activity, something that, you know, multiple parties have entered into willingly and have formed certain kinds of shared intentions. You can spell that out kind of however you want, but that's sort of basically what we tend to see in kind of accounts of co-authorship. Now, when we look at whether an AI system could aspire to kind of being a co-author, this is where we might sort of start to run into some difficulties when we start to think about that sort of like, particularly like the uncoerced element. Can an AI sort of autonomously agree to make an image with you, like a certain kind of image? The evidence would suggest probably not. Recent events with that Google engineer might, maybe, you know, who knows, might suggest otherwise, but the evidence points to the fact that, you know, AI systems, you know, whilst they might do certain things autonomously, they don't have the kind of intentional autonomy that we might demand of agents, you know, working together, willingly forming intentions to take on responsibility for the creation of a certain kind of work. So it seems that it's probably a real stretch, if we're going to try and call AIs co-authors. Now, if we look at kind of co-creators, this Katerina Banzanichi's accounts where, you know, it might be the case that there are agents like kind of master printmakers who are really very skilled at what they're doing. They're really bringing something to the table. They might not be kind of taking on full responsibility for kind of the whole work. But then nonetheless kind of contributing this skilled, kind of artistically informed labor to a project. And so in that case, you know, we could maybe start to look at kind of, well, okay, are AIs contributing this sort of skilled, artistically informed labor to the kind of project of bringing kind of a work of art into being? And this is where, again, we might start to run into some difficulties if we think about what we mean by kind of like artistically informed labor. So AI systems as they are, they're often trained so that they kind of map maybe certain semantic content to certain kinds of syntactic features, if we kind of think about images in that way. So it might be that, you know, they've learned sort of like what an angry cat looks like. And, you know, are very good at generating things that look like what we would describe as an angry cat. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have an actual kind of understanding of what it means to be an angry cat, right? And sometimes we see that. We might see kind of little blips when, you know, an image comes out when we're like, what? That's not even a cat, let alone, you know. But it's somehow kind of, you know, formed this association, if you like, this kind of mapping between the two things that to us is just manifestly wrong. But, you know, because we don't really understand the kind of associations that AI systems make, all of this is deeply hidden due to neural networks, deep neural networks, which means that we don't necessarily know how AI systems sort of arrive at the conclusions that they do. And that's part of their appeal in many senses. It also makes it very ethically scary when we're dealing with, you know, things like autonomous cars, you know, how an AI has determined that that's a person or that's not a person. Anyway, those sorts of questions aside, that it's a little bit less scary when we're dealing kind of with art and aesthetic things. It's a little bit safer to kind of maybe explore some of those unknown territories, and that's part of the fun, really, of working with an AI system very often. But the key thing is, there's not this artistically informed labor that it's very easy to spot, particularly when we think about the fact that, kind of coming back to that uncoerced point as well, you know, it's not like an AI system can just decide, I don't want to make something that looks photorealistic today. Actually, I would like to make something that is like, looks like a relief sculpture. You know, it kind of can't make those sorts of decisions that we would expect to see of someone who is an artistic kind of co-creator. And so again, we sort of begin to run into those issues, and it seems again unlikely that we can really call an AI a kind of, you know, creative partner in that sort of sense as well. So we're kind of running out of options here when we're thinking about the kind of, you know, artistically relevant sorts of collaboration that we might encounter. Where we do perhaps see a little bit more hope is thinking about agents who help others to kind of fulfill and make their artistic works without necessarily kind of putting too much or maybe any creativity into doing that themselves. So for instance, it might be the case that some agents help an artist realize their work through a particular kind of process. And maybe, you know, if we look at like a kind of master printmaker like Monsieur Tatin, who helped Picasso create these almost impossible lithographs, lithographic prints, because he innovated a process that would allow the sorts of materials that Picasso wanted in his prints to be printed. So in that case, you know, we might say that there is a creativity that is relevant in a slightly more kind of distanced way to the creation of this work. Without that kind of creative insight, there would have been, the prints would not have been in existence. So, you know, in that sense, that there maybe is some creativity there. And it may be, you know, sometimes the case that assistants or kind of technicians might offer sort of, you know, suggestions for kind of how the formal features of a work might kind of work best. And in those sorts of cases, you know, then perhaps there's a little bit of creativity, a little bit of freedom for these agents to sort of innovate and kind of contribute to the kind of artistic creativity involved in this project. Other times it might be the case, as with Damien Hirst's assistants, for instance, where they might be given very direct instructions, like you need to paint this number of dots in these colors, and that's it. There's just no room for kind of any sort of creativity. It's a very mechanical act. And often that is artistically relevant. I mean, if you look at kind of Damien Hirst's spot paintings, he said he wanted these paintings to look like a person trying to paint like a machine. And so essentially instructing people to paint like a machine is artistically relevant. Doesn't, you know, allow for the creativity on the part of the person who's doing the painting, but, you know, it's still artistically relevant to consider. which is a point I will come back to. But the key thing is then, there maybe sometimes is a little bit of scope for some kind of creative contribution within the sort of broader, someone else's broader kind of artistic project. Now, for some of the reasons that I've just highlighted, we might struggle to attribute artistic creativity to an AI system. One of the reasons being that if we look at kind of some definitions of artistic creativity, it seems that you're going to need, and again, coming back to that kind of artistically informed labor point, some understanding of how to create the kinds of values that you're aiming to produce. If you just produce by accident, let's say you went through pixel by pixel and just happened to produce something that sort of ends up looking like an artwork, you probably would be not inclined to attribute artistic creativity to you as an agent. So I'm not really sure why we would then want to do that for a machine, essentially. Okay, so we're looking then for the kind of relevant intentionality in the process, this balance between spontaneity and also some form of kind of directed kind of control as well, something that's informed by a knowledge of how to produce certain values, perhaps. This doesn't necessarily mean that an agent's going to know exactly what kind of features their work is going to have or exactly how they're going to kind of arrive at those features, but you need to kind of have some kind of broad sense of how you want these things to proceed. If for no other reason, the fact it'd be very difficult to make something without knowing roughly what kind of thing you're going to make or how, and you'd run into all sorts of problems trying to source things, materials to kind of do your making. So this is sort of Bereskort's insight that there is this condition, this spontaneity condition where, there's this balance between directed control, spontaneity, and this is kind of ultimately what we sort of need for a agential creativity in order to be able to attribute creativity to a particular agent. Another key insight from Gort is the fact that when we talk about kind of knowledge of how to create the relevant values, this doesn't necessarily mean kind of value to core or sort of some sort of kind of abstract sense of value. We can be very specific about what kind of value we're talking about. And again, in the context of what we're talking about here, we're thinking more specifically about artistic value. And so we would expect these systems then to kind of have some sort of understanding or some kind of insight in how to create works with certain kinds of artistic value. So this, of course, brings us then to the question, and this whole thing is obviously just a Pandora's box of one question after another, but what exactly is artistic value? And that, again, is a very broad question, one which I'm not even going to begin to attempt to answer here, but we can broadly think about a sort of spectrum, for maybe a monist conception of artistic value, perhaps as some kind of essentially aesthetic sort of value. We might go with someone like Nick Zangwill, who kind of claims that it's someone who has an insight into perhaps the dependency of aesthetic properties, of non-aesthetic properties, and then intentionally endows something with those properties. So we might kind of go from that sort of conception all the way through to something like a kind of cluster account, again, sort of Berescort sort of territory, where perhaps a necessary condition is that an artwork is something that's intentionally produced, but otherwise it might be any kind of number of kind of disjuncts of sort of things that we might attribute as being sort of relevant to artistic value. Whichever way we kind of take it, this monist or pluralist account of artistic value, the key thing is, again, we kind of come back to this thing of there needs to be some form of intentionality coming into this. And again, it just isn't clear that AI systems possess the relevant kind of intentionality or indeed have intentions. This is something that, it's still to be developed as far as the kind of latest research would suggest. AI systems don't sort of have their own kind of inner lives and that kind of intentional autonomy to be able to kind of do these sorts of undertakings without significant direction from a human agent. And as we've already kind of highlighted, don't necessarily kind of have their own, what we might call knowledge that would enable them to kind of create things that can be said to be the bearers of artistic value, and so to be responsible for their creation. So yeah, overall, not looking too positive for our AI systems to kind of count as these sort of autonomous artists who are able to kind of collaborate with us as we might collaborate with another human being, perhaps as a co-author or a co-creator, or just a sort of creative partner, perhaps, or someone who's kind of contributing to a work. The best sort of option, as far as I can see, is that we think of them as being a bit like, and this is a real cop-out, as being sort of akin to those agents who have a little bit of freedom sometimes to maybe kind of determine maybe, you know, some of the formal features or some of the salient features of a work of art. So one example that we might think of to kind of demonstrate what this looks like in human terms is a work by Antony Gormley, where he instructed, he asked members of the public to volunteer to have casts made of their bodies, from which he instructed a group of welders to create these kind of series of metal kind of arrangements within these casts, and it was up to the welders. They had a certain number of pieces that they could use, and they had to kind of join in a certain way, but it was up to them otherwise how they kind of arranged these metal pieces within the space of someone else's body, essentially. And so that might be an example where we see agents being given a little bit of freedom to kind of determine some of the kind of formal properties of the work. Not all the formal properties, of course. Gormley's already determined that they're going to be these particular kind of metal kind of pieces joined together in these particular ways, but nevertheless, the actual kind of, when you kind of see this work, I think it's called field. Each human kind of metal kind of arrangement does look very different and distinctive, and so you can sort of see that someone has had a little bit of freedom to sort of input their own sort of artistic insight into the work. So we might sort of, you know, think of that as being like a creative contribution to the work, and we could maybe draw a sort of analogy to an AI system as making kind of generative contributions, if you like. They're a little bit like some of those sort of partnerships that humans can form when they're working to create a piece together, where there's, you know, quite clearly a kind of hierarchy of kind of who's kind of, you know, the executive agent, if you like, who's kind of overseeing the kind of responsible for kind of the artistic values of the work as a whole. But yeah, with a little bit of scope for some agents to kind of make a contribution that's also going to kind of be a part of that endeavor. So yeah, we can perhaps think of AIs as making these sort of generative contributions. They generate formal properties or features of a work that are often unexpected, new, as we've kind of highlighted, and are often, you know, extremely important to think about in relation to kind of perhaps the kind of overall sort of intentions for the work. You know, an amazing artist called Anna Ridler was using AI systems or generative adversarial networks pretty early on. And she, for instance, created this recreation actually of a kind of early horror film. And she created these ink drawings of the work. She kind of trained this AI model on the film, on her drawings. And it produced these sort of really uncanny renditions, these sort of blurry, pixelated kind of renditions of her images. And this really fed into this sort of uncanny films that were kind of overt in the film. And so in this case, you know, the generation of those sort of formal properties, which weren't finally specified or determined by Anna Ridler, were really relevant to kind of, you know, considering what that work was about, and kind of where its value was as well, kind of where the artistic value is to be found in that work. And so I think that's probably kind of where I would sort of situate them. They're sort of like quasi collaborators. They, you know, and kind of phenomenologically as well, the experience of working with one, as I say, it does feel like you are in this reciprocal relation. It does feel like a joint effort when you're kind of, you know, getting that kind of feedback loop kind of on the go. And so it definitely kind of takes on some of the characteristics of feeling like you are sort of working with another agent, even though realistically, this is a system that has been trained to do a very specific thing, albeit very well often, but nevertheless does at least give the appearance of sort of working with you.
Yeah, right. And there may be a sense there that you're giving over some of your agency to this thing, which itself is not an agent, right? And so the feeling of collaboration is like when you're working with someone else and, you're co-agents. And so maybe you're giving, I mean, you would be giving up some of your freedom so that they can have their freedom, so that collectively you can have more freedom to work together. But you're doing it with a system that itself lacks freedom, it lacks creativity, spontaneity, intentionality, right? And so there may be a sense in which you're impoverishing your own agency to make this thing. And I mean, that's probably not true, but that's just like the initial thought that came to my head with respect to the last point you made there.
But then, that sort of opens up some really interesting questions about kind of constraints. And this is something else I'm really interested in, kind of this idea of how constraints can be really productive for creativity. And, if you even thinking of sort of a parallel here, I think T. Nguyen in his book, Games Art as Agency, probably got that title wrong, haven't I? But he writes about the kind of rules-free view of autonomy, the idea being that, fewer rules equals more autonomy, but that's not necessarily true if you consider that, he uses a lovely example of kind of an empty field, you can do whatever you want in it, but suddenly, if you have something in this field, like a kind of structure, suddenly there are new ways that you can kind of exert your agency in this space. And so far from kind of inhibiting or restricting you in some way, it's actually opened up new avenues. And I think that something similar can be said for kind of the use of kind of AI systems. There might be an argument like it sort of impoverishes the kind of some of the acts that we might consider to be really key for the creation of artistic products. But on the other hand, maybe it opens up kind of new avenues. Maybe some of the kind of having some choices taken away can perhaps open up the avenues for different kinds of choices to be made, perhaps at different points in the process. And so, yeah, we needn't be pessimistic, I think, about artists impoverishing their own agency through the use of these systems. But I think it does take kind of careful navigation and a real sort of insight into where sort of interesting voluntary choices then perhaps can be made when working with these systems.
Yeah, that's awesome. So Claire, thank you so much for talking with me. This was really fun and really enlightening.
Thank you so much, Brandon. It's great.